Hello. So I'd like to present today a précis of my research to date. This practice-based work focuses on immersive technology and virtual reality and explores the question, how can immersive and semi-immersive technologies affect production and reception of installation art? Many applications explore VR in other contextual frameworks, such as gaming, education, and psychology. The thesis asks, can creating something intended as art require a different approach? The underlying focus for these works under discussion is isolation. Can a feeling of isolation be intensified in an immersive environment? There are three particular aspects of importance. The first is related to the idea of immersion being an isolating experience in itself. When a person puts on a VR headset, they will almost by definition become physically isolated. Thus, they are perceptually isolated from the physical world. The second is autobiographical. I was born 11 years apart from my nearest sibling and lived a life of an only child. So some parts of my life have been spent in isolation of a sort. I spent 2 years living in Yorkshire in a caravan with 2 cats. Each of these periods was to a degree self-reflective and also introspective, and thus this study is part autoethnographical. The third is psychological. That is an element of social isolation. Philosopher Gaston Bachelard writes in The Poetics of Space, psychoanalysis too often situates the passions in the sensory. In reality, however, the passions simmer and re-simmer in solitude. The passionate being prepares his explosions and his exploits in this solitude, and all the spaces of our past moments of solitudes, the spaces in which we have suffered from solitude, enjoyed, desired, and compromised solitude, remains indelible within us, and precisely because the human being wants them to remain so. In terms of virtual space, this can be seen as equally true. As in the sole game player prepares his explosions and exploits them in solitary gameplay. What then of art in a solitary space, a virtual space? So social theorist Brian Masumi discusses some relevant aspects of this study in Parables for the Virtual. Masumi writes of an experiment which shows that impulses to skin electrodes were actually felt half a second before a conscious realization of that impulse. He says, this requires a reworking of how we think about the body. Something that happens too quickly to have happened actually is virtual. The body is as immediately virtual as it is actual. The virtual, the pressing crowd of incipiencies and tendencies, is a realm of the potential. In this light, the affective impulse, such as an emotion, is not conscious until we conceive an idea of what it is. Our initial reaction to a piece of art may be different to our conscious reflection of it. We may experience a sense of isolation in an art piece and only afterwards consciously articulate it. Initial explorations explored an interactive cube. The intent was to explore a VR installation and its experience as an art piece. A cube was made as a single entity within a virtual space which was intentionally bound, and the cube itself was responsive to the presence of the viewer. Various experimental versions were made which produced certain responses when approached. The basic algorithmic trigger for this was avoidance. When approached at a certain distance, the cube would move to another position. At the same time, it changed shape, texture, and rotation. Changes were rapid, and a temporal experience resulted, almost teleporting the user from one space to another at any given instant. Initial feedback suggested that the shifting cube was jarring and somewhat playful and limited the experience of the environment. This led to a further iteration that focused more on the idea of temporal slowness, allowing the viewer more time to experience the surroundings through subtle changes. A work in progress, the working title of the second iteration, The Isolation of Self, attempts to create a familiar room representing Bachelar's notions of spaces and past moments of solitude. Time changes to light, dark, day and night offer the viewer passages of time. Texture and colour adding a sense of isolation. Artist Sarah Rothenberg produced a VR interactive installation, Memory Place My House. This work explores the artist's childhood home through a virtual recreation using home movies, diaries, and photographs. The virtual reality headset is situated in a physical installation that is simultaneously anachronistic and futuristic, featuring brightly coloured furniture and a pre-flat screen television feed in the virtual home. Rothenberg writes, the installation speculates on the emotional impact that future archiving technologies will have on personal memories in the immediate wake of Facebook's purchase of Oculus. Precedent for my current work include artists who focused upon isolation as a subject, and in particular Edward Hopper. He's well known for his paintings that create feelings of loneliness and isolation. Olivia Laing in The Lonely City discusses Hopper's work. What Hopper's urban scenes also replicate is one of the central experiences of being lonely, the way a feeling of separation, of being walled off or penned in, combines with a sense of near unbearable exposure. His paintings have a strong sense of light, shade, hues, which again Laing describes with respect to one of his most famous paintings, Nighthawks. Green shadows were falling in spikes and diamonds on the sidewalk. There is no colour in existence so powerfully communicates urban alienation, the atomization of human beings inside the edifices they create, as this noxious, pallid green. Many of his paintings include figures, but some are just part of a room, such as this sun in an empty room. This painting depicts a room. It's devoid of contents, as far as one can tell. Strong light falls through the window, creating patches of light. And the use of shadows in this way is one of the features of Hopper's work. The light creates an atmosphere without the need for narrative. The walls contain a texture which is mixed with that tinge of green mentioned by Laing. The window gives out onto foliage and in itself obscures the view, almost hemming one in. Laing described that sense of separation, being penned in, and this painting certainly sustains that idea, an idea of isolation, that which Laing writes that Hopper himself admitted, citing an interview for a book called The Artist's Voice, where he said, "I probably am a lonely one." In VR, art is formed in 3 dimensions, with textures, light, and modelling. But also there's the prospect of adding time, motion, and potentially other senses like smell or sound. An artist needs to understand how to build these into an installation in such a way that they become affective and communicate something to the viewer. Because VR is a immersive experience, it can realise the potential of many different disciplines in one installation. One can combine painting, sculptural forms with motion, changing light, patterns. The viewer is able to move within the installation itself, but the artist can control these aspects in terms of limiting the viewer's motion. But there are also constraints, and one can draw on parallels in other fields. For example, bunker archaeology. Cultural theorist Paul Virilio poses the idea that from the Second World War onwards, the continuance of military developments and the deployment of nuclear weapons increased a worldwide formation of a bunker network. Defensive strategies increased fortifications with a retreat underground. He writes, "The blockhouse is still familiar. It coexists. It comes from an era that put an end to the strategic notion of forward and rear and began a new one of above and below, in which burial would be accomplished definitively and the earth nothing more than an immense glacis exposed to nuclear fire." If we take this concept into the modern idiom of digital worlds, we can note that protectionism is one of the paramount concerns in terms of securing the borders of, say, a banking system or a website. Cyber and digital attacks are increasingly common in virtual space, and in many cases they are purported to come from hostile government agencies rather than individuals of criminal intent. Hence, the virtual world becomes bounded and closed in. It might be argued that the defense of cyberspace almost mirrors that of the Second World War Atlantic coast. And indeed, such cyberspace defenses are known as firewalls, although the concern is the protection of data rather than people. Ultimately, this is billed as being performed on behalf of the people. In a similar vein, Matsumi argues, change is an emergent relation, the becoming sensible in empirical conditions of mixture, of a modulation of potential. Post-emergence, there is capture and containment. Rules are codified and applied. So maybe currently our culture is in a moment of emergence with regards to the VR world. Post-emergence, it is likely there will be restrictions and rules within the frameworks of VR. How is this constriction to be avoided? Especially in the field of art, is a matter of future interest. Further note how the changes in context change the paradigm. Matsumi says of an audience viewing a football match on TV effectively in virtual space. The point of view of the television audience is different. Its individuations do not fold directly back onto the field of play. Quite to the contrary, through the TV audience, the play folds out of its own event space and into another. The televised game enters the home as a domestic player. The peak event of a football season is said to correspond to an increase in domestic violence. The home entry of the game at its crest of intensity upsets the fragile equilibrium of the household. It poses the idea the televised game recreates a new event in the home where it imposes a different order on things influenced by the dynamics of the game. So one can say that virtual reality enters a person into a new context, a new order of things which subsume the order of their physical life. The influences and dynamics and constraints that are imposed within the physical universe may no longer apply. So we need to define perhaps what those new dimensions are. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have 5 minutes for questions. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Yes? You've got a question? No.
Thank you. I got a thumbs up.
But you probably don't want to ask them Yes.
I just wondering why you chose the cube, or what was the reason?
There's no. It was because it's a simple form and four-sided, so that it creates shadows, light, and shade, and there wasn't another particular reason, although there are sort of precedents for cubes. For example, there's a whole set of psychological tests based upon a cube and what you imagine the cube to be. So that's really the only reason that I chose a cube. I mean, it could have been a sphere, for example.
The cube as a
Well,
A very, very practical kind of question. The photographs that you showed, where
yeah.
did they all come from?
Well, the ones that were mine, I took those photographs.
You took a lot of those photographs yourself?
Yes,
Yeah.
and I sort of intensified certain aspects because that's whole part of the theme of isolation. So it was to try to convey that theme within that sort of pictorial text.
And you'd taken most of the photographs?
I took the ones that said author's own.
Right.
Yes.
Other questions?
You mentioned that in VR you have the opportunity to play with sound as well as
Yes, that's true.
Will you be including sound in the research as well?
Definitely, I want to include a number of different senses, so sound in particular, because that alters, again, the context and the framework of the installation. So it's an important part of it. So I want to make sure that it's like exploring a 360-degree set of senses, if you like, rather than just visual and kinetic, say.
I want to ask
Should be asking them all later.
So is there anything you'd like to say?
Just putting me on the spot. It's kind of it's an interesting practice, and I think for me, because we come from quite different, as an supervisor from two different backgrounds that apply across, but you're kind of at the moment, like any beginning thesis, it starts with a quite a broad focus
Yes.
at this point, and what these kind of opportunities provide is a moment to begin to allow where the is headed, and I think that's a good way
Thank you.
to think about those things. And I also kind of find it interesting as a designer, how we're always resolving it's a response to issues or design issues or problems, and at the same time you're elaborating an art. So I kind of wonder how that will unravel in terms of actually practicing as a designer and as an artist.
So I'd like to thank you. And
Thank you very
wish
much.
you best wishes for your PGR9.
Thank you.
So if we could thank David again.